Hello all, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, a roomier bay, 6th of September 2014. If parking bays in shopping centres satisfied the requirements of the Australian standard AS 2890.1, then fewer people might cheat in Acrod bays. Many of the bay widths at supermarkets in my area are below standard width, and some aisle widths are below the standard. Designing to the standard would reduce back and hip injuries and small scratches and dents in vehicles. It would also improve traffic flow and reduce congestion and frustration. No, I don't cheat in Acrod bays. Vince Dooley, Attadale. Okay, so Acrod bays are disabled bays, that is. So, here's the thing. Yes, there is a problem with people who are not disabled parking in disabled bays. My experience has been that those people generally are not motivated to do so simply because they find normal bays to be too thin. In fact, the pressure on supermarkets and other establishments to have smaller and smaller bays and less and less space between the bays, aisles to drive down, is actually that they want to provide more bays given the amount of room they've got. I've been involved in some planning for an office space where we had to plan for car parking bays, and our major concern was to provide as many bays as we could given the space we had. And so yes, it was, in the end, we did design it to be, the bays to be smaller than the Australian standard. There's nothing illegal in that. The Australian standard is a guideline, not a legal requirement. And we did that purely because if we'd gone by the Australian standard, we would have had less bays and less people would have been able to park there. I suspect that if all of the bays in your local supermarket, say, were at Australian standard, there would be less places to park. And there certainly would be less places to park near to the shops. And I actually think that would people would be more likely then to park in the disabled bays because they wouldn't be able to find anywhere else to park. Yes, there's probably some issue with back and hip injuries in terms of being able to get in and out of your car easily. And I know in some places where the bays are rather small, it can be very difficult to actually get in and out of your car. And I do recognise that, and less dents and scratches, absolutely. But overwhelmingly, shopping centres they want to provide as big a bay as possible. They don't want to inconvenience their shoppers, but at the same time, they want to provide as many bays. And so there's this constant trade-off. The real issue with people parking in disabled bays is the lack of enforcement. So the problem here is that the car parks are administered and owned by the shopping centres, the actual shops that own them. But they have no power to actually fine people for parking in the bays. So the enforcement of disabled bay regulations is up to the local council. And so between the two, they have generally very little interest in doing so. The shopping centres tend not to want to police it at all because they don't like to annoy the people who park in disabled bays, who far outweigh the actual disabled people, who often have very little choice but to go to the large shopping centres. And on the other hand, the councils, for whatever reason, don't seem particularly keen on enforcing it. So what they really need to do is actually bump up the enforcement. Recently they've increased fines here to $2,000 for parking in disabled bay illegally. But in of itself, that's not going to be any deterrent at all unless it's enforced. I suspect that the $2,000 fine, some of that money would go to the local council. So I suspect they would be much more keen on enforcing them nowadays, now that there's a bigger fine attached. But that's the real problem. It's got nothing to do with the bay sizes particularly, and much more to do with the fact that people... In my experience, people who park in disabled bays generally do so because they cannot be bothered looking for another spot, or they haven't been able to find a spot within what they consider a reasonable distance, and therefore they justify their parking disabled bays by saying, well, I'm only going to be quick and I couldn't find any more spots. I have yet to hear somebody justify it to me, and I worked in a prison, and many, many criminals will park in disabled bays because they are fairly antisocial people. And they never justified it on the basis of needing the space. They always justified it on the basis of it not really, to them, feeling like they were harming anybody, and seeing that their own interests in parking close to the shopping centre was, all that really mattered to them. Next up, Punish a Kiss. 6th of September 2014. I have no sympathy for school students who are the subject of homophobic bullying by their peers. Guide to Help School with Gay Issues, 29th of the 8th. A student's life should not be for excursions and experimentations in the adult world of sex on school premises. I blame the Ministry of Education for being so weak and pathetic in not laying down strict rules for school behaviour. The Ministry should adopt and proclaim a 3-strike rule for conduct such as kissing, holding hands, hugging in a sexual manner on school premises. This may sound harsh and from a different era, but it will bring home to both students and their parents that school is for study, sport, and perhaps musical appreciation, but definitely not for sexual experimentation. Teenage pregnancies are the results of the lack of any rules at all. M.J. Bateman, Denmark. There is so much wrong with this letter. Yes, it does sound like it's from a different era, and not least of which because you're referring to the Ministry of Education that hasn't existed for at least 20 years now. It's the Department of Education now. Secondly, teenage pregnancies are not the result of a lack of rules. Teenage pregnancies are a result of many different things, but in fact, the current education around sexual health actually reduces teenage pregnancies, and teenage pregnancy rates in many places, especially here in WA where we have comprehensive sexual education for all students, teenage pregnancies have been steadily going down over the years, in part at least because of this comprehensive sex education. So actually, educating students on issues of sexuality does reduce teenage pregnancies. Now, on to this issue of homophobic bullying. On one hand, you say that you have no sympathy for people who are bullied, but on the other hand, you want the Department of Education to lay down strict rules for school behaviour. I would have expected that these strict rules, any reasonable set of rules, would actually ban bullying altogether, and therefore would prevent these kinds of issues if they were enforced. Now, the other thing is, I would be prepared to bet money that the overwhelming majority of children who are bullied in a homophobic manner have not done so on the basis of them kissing, holding hands, or hugging in a sexual manner. And therefore, to ban those behaviours is hardly going to reduce homophobic bullying. I would bet money that the vast majority of homophobic bullying is done on the basis of the way that somebody simply presents themselves or the way that they act. And not on the basis of them engaging in some kind of homosexual behaviour on school premises. These kind of things, I would be prepared to bet money, are vanishingly rare on school grounds. That kissing, holding hands and hugging is relatively rare. Certainly when I was in high school, which, okay, admittedly was 20-odd years ago now, but my wife's a high school teacher, and from what she said, that these kind of behaviours are not particularly common, even amongst heterosexual students. On the other hand, there is a lot of development of sexuality. It's just not done through those kind of overtly sexual behaviours. High school students are adolescents, for the most part, and adolescence is a time of great development, not just academically, but also socially. And a large part of the social development of adolescence is focused on gender and sexuality. And so no matter what you say in terms of banning particular behaviours, adolescents throughout history, and will continue to do so, to experiment with their gender and their sexuality. They will just simply do it in ways that they can get away with. And anybody who says they have no compassion for bullying victims, I'm sorry, that kind of heartlessness bothers me greatly. Nobody deserves to be bullied, no matter what. I mean, because here's the other thing. Even if you are engaging in kissing, holding hands, and hugging in a sexual manner, and you are a homosexual, you do not deserve to be bullied. Full stop. No heterosexual deserves to be bullied. No homosexual deserves to be bullied. Nobody who is not even anywhere on that gender binary deserves to be bullied. Nobody who deserves to be bullied for their sexuality, but nobody deserves to be bullied for anything else. And anybody who says they have no sympathy for it, I think you have trouble with just the basic human compassion. I guess the good news is that that kind of lack of compassion for, children is of a bygone era, and it's only holdouts like you who are still like that. That the vast majority of people in this day and age, at least, do have compassion for bullying victims and do see it as completely unacceptable. Concern over silence, 6th of September 2014. The murder of and posting online of video of this latest beheading weighs on my mind. It was not a legitimate, if barbaric, decapitation with a guillotine or an axe or scimitar. This is barbaric, unsanctioned butchering by extreme fanatics. They have no possible justifications to shield their actions. Their demand and pursuit of an Islamic caliphate is centuries out of date, but it silences supposed moderates because it's a tenet of Islam. The resounding silence from the international Muslim communities on these atrocities is half expected. The silence from the Australian Islamic community is, at best, disappointing. Andrew Power Kingsley. Okay, so I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that your grammar was butchered by the editors here. Yes, the beheading of anybody is appalling. To do so in the name of any religion is appalling. Any violence like that is unacceptable and should be unacceptable to every person in this world. And I suspect that you're right, that there are large portions of the Muslim world who do not necessarily agree with this, but who are unwilling to come out publicly and condemn it because the creation of some kind of Islamic theocracy is probably seen as a good thing by a great many Muslims. And so I suspect that there is probably a number of organisations in the world who are stuck between, one, not supporting the Islamic State as they are in the Middle East, but also at the same time not wanting to alienate their members or their sort of core demographic of people who generally agree with the idea of a sort of, Muslim government. Now, I don't know how big that is, and I don't know how small that is in an international setting. And I suspect that the person writing this letter in also has no idea about it. But in the basis of the Australian Islamic community, well, to say that Australian Islamic groups, such as they are overwhelmingly are set up to simply represent the interests of Australian Muslims. And what any other Muslims do around the world is not really their remit. And so to say that they, on one hand, you hold them accountable in some way, that they should come out and make statements about the actions of any other Muslims around the world who happen to do horrible things, I think this is the kind of standard that we only hold Muslim groups to. The fact that there are, in Uganda, Christian groups with government permission beating to death homosexuals, we don't expect Christian groups here in Australia to make a comment on that. We're quite able to separate out the actions of Ugandan Christians from the actions of, the responsibilities of Australian Christians. We see these as two separate groups, and we don't think that, some people might say, the Australian churches should come out and condemn this, but most of us don't really see there being much of a connection. But we do see Muslims as being a monolithic group, that all Muslims somehow represent each other, and that any Muslim organisation here somehow has to distance itself from the actions of Muslims in the Middle East. And I suspect that we do this only on the basis that we see them as an outgroup. We see Muslims as being an outgroup from us, and therefore they are one homogenous mass, which is a fairly common bias, that we tend to see outgroups as homogenous. We tend to see a single member of an outgroup as representative of the whole, and we don't do that with in-groups. So we see Christians as being much more of an in-group. Even us secular people tend to see Christians, because we're more familiar with them, as being part of the in-group, and so we don't hold individual Christians here accountable for the Christians of actions elsewhere. When the Westboro Baptist Church picket the funerals of gay people, or actually not even gay people, of soldiers, we don't expect other churches particularly to come out and condemn that. It's nice when they do, and some churches do that, but generally speaking, we don't expect that. And we do seem to be expecting that with Muslim groups. And I would just like to point out that now, to all those people who think that Muslims are some kind of homogenous mass, that there is a great deal of difference between, say, European Muslims, particularly Bosnians. So a large proportion of the Bosnian population are Bosnian Muslims, and they are culturally and religiously quite different from, say, the secular Muslims in Turkey, to the Saudi Muslims, the Wahhabi sect of Muslims, the Pakistani Muslims have quite a different culture, and particularly the world's largest Muslim democracy, which is our nearest neighbour, one of our nearest neighbours, of Indonesia here. they all and Malaysia next door. So they all practice their Islam quite differently and have different cultural impacts. And so to say that any one group of Muslims is responsible for the actions or should apologise for or should distance themselves from the actions of other groups of Muslims simply because they share an overarching faith, I think does a disservice to the heterogeneity of that religion. Now, if you want to mount the argument that Islam is more homogenous than, say, Christianity, I would accept that. But that's not to say that Islam is entirely homogenous. It isn't. And the vast majority of Muslims here in Australia, certainly in WA, are not Middle Eastern Muslims. They are Southeast Asian Muslims who have quite a different cultural heritage and don't necessarily see themselves as represented by members of the Islamic State in Iraq or Syria. Short circuit, 8th of September 2014. So WA Police and Edith Cowan University are jointly researching why the incidence of vehicles crashing into houses is rising. Bessie counts her blessings 6th and 9th. I can save them time and money. It's because of idiots speeding in residential areas. Research concluded. Danny Joyce, cooling up. I really, really hate this trope. It's a lazy, lazy trope, and it stretches back at least 60 or 70 years that I'm aware of. This idea that these kind of research questions have simple answers and therefore the research doesn't need to be done. So apparently there has been an increase in the number of cars crashing into residential properties recently here. And WA Police and one of our local universities have got together to do a research project into that. So essentially what they want to do is try and prevent crashes into buildings. Now, whenever you want to implement some policy, you want to come up with a policy to try and change behaviour, the first thing you need to do is actually understand what are the drivers of this behaviour so that you can then address those drivers. And to simply put in place simplistic solutions based on an assumption about what causes it leads to all sorts of stupid policy decisions and wasted government money. So I applaud the fact that they're willing to actually research this. And yes, I would agree with the letter writer if what they were saying is it's likely that speeding in residential areas was a contributing factor. I would absolutely agree with that. I suspect that speed is a contributing factor in almost all collisions, regardless of the situation. But most drivers speed much of the time. We know this. And so we know that most drivers don't crash most of the time. So we know that speeding is not the sole factor. And simply reducing speeds or reducing the rate at which the numbers of people speeding probably won't reduce the amount of crashes particularly. And also reducing speed overall is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It requires a lot of effort to achieve even minimal reductions. Reducing speed has been one of those perennial targets for public campaigns by police and also other sort of government agencies. And it's never that effective, no matter how much effort they put into it. I mean, we've targeted a lot of our resources recently, over the last sort of 20 years, into reducing speed around schools, particularly primary schools, but other schools as well, because we recognise that these are particularly dangerous areas to speed in. And so a lot of time, effort and resources has gone into that, and has managed to reduce those speed. And it's that kind of targeted focus that is needed here. And so doing the research into what actually is causing people to crash into houses, given how dangerous that can be, is overwhelmingly a good idea. I'm reminded of, there was a piece of research that came out, I think it was just post-World War II, where essentially they showed that what happens with a lot of this research is often they do some research like this, they come up with some findings, and everybody in hindsight goes, well, that was obvious. But if you put the findings completely the opposite, people would still say, oh, well, that was obvious. So some of the things that came out after World War II was that they found that people draftees in the American Army who came from the city were less likely to commit suicide than draftees who came from the countryside. And everybody said, oh, well, that makes sense. But when they proposed to people that perhaps the research could have gone the other way, people would say, oh, yeah, it makes sense that people from the country would have, committed suicide at a less rate. That is, what makes sense to us is hardly a reliable guide as to what is the truth. And so this kind of research is incredibly important. And I hate this lazy argument that always comes out that we should just go with the simplistic solution. Last up for this week, whatever next, 9th of September 2014. Recently, as I walked to the Coburn train station, I saw a for sale sign on top of a legally parked car. Returning some hours later, I was amazed to see a $100 fine for parking in a thoroughfare for purposes of sale. Parking fine gouging is getting completely out of hand. Gary Sprunt, Jandakot. Well, okay, minor quibble. They weren't really parked legally because they had a sign on their car for sale. But I would agree with you that this is treading a thin line. So it's generally accepted if you put a sign in the rear of your car window that says that your car is for sale with your details, that if you happen to park that car somewhere, that you are probably not parking that car with the purpose of sale. But this car in particular had a sign, a homemade sign on its roof that did make it look like it was specifically being parked there so that it would be exposed to passers-by to maximise its chance of sale. And when I looked up the regulations, this is a pretty commonly not allowed by almost all councils that I could come across the whole of Australia. So the basic idea is that it's a fairly common practice here. If you're selling your car privately, you put a sign in the back window or whatever saying, for sale, amount, here's my number. And then a lot of people will then park that car on, say, a verge or on somebody's lawn on a high traffic location so that lots of people driving past will see it, rather than just simply parking it in their driveway where no one will see it. And that's fairly commonly accepted. Now, this car was parked in a car parking space on a thoroughfare, that is, on the side of a road. And councils, almost all councils across Australia, as far as I could tell, do not allow that. That you are not allowed to simply park your car in a car parking space for the purposes of exposing it to potential buyers. This makes some sense because overwhelmingly the car parking spaces are there for people to make use of so that they can access local shops and businesses, not for them to conduct their private business of selling their car. What I think is that this is treading a line between simply having the sign on your car as you drive around and do your normal business versus deliberately parking it in a place so as to expose it to the most number of people. And I think that's probably... Yeah, I think if they hadn't made a sign and put it on the roof of the car, they probably would have gotten away with this. But there you go. I guess they could always take it to court and dispute it. Anyway, that's it for this week. I've had a good rant. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.